Hello, I am Abigail Cook, and I will be presenting the wrongful conviction of Ricky Jackson. So, the agenda today, we're going to go over a timeline of the case, the critical issue connected to the case, and then the next 4 slides will connect our chapters to certain aspects of the case. Alright, the facts and timeline of the case go like this. May 19th, 1975 was the beginning where Harold Franks, a 59-year-old man, was leaving a grocery store in Cleveland, Ohio. He was robbed by 2 men who stole a briefcase and ended up beating him with a pipe, throwing acid in his face, and then shooting him twice in the chest, which ultimately killed him. The briefcase, I believe, only had about over $400 in it. Less than a week later, on May 25th, Ricky Jackson and his friends Ronnie and Wiley Bridgman were arrested in connection with the crime after 12-year-old Edward Vernon identified them as the culprits, claiming that Jackson was the ringleader and the gunman. A few months later, in August 1975, Jackson and Bridgman were convicted, despite the only evidence being Vernon's eyewitness testimony. In 2011, the Cleveland Scene magazine decided to reinvestigate and took a closer look at all the inconsistencies in the case and called out that Vernon had been paid to testify. In 2013, a couple years later, Vernon admitted to lying in his testimony to his pastor, and he claimed that he was pressured by police officers. In November 2014, after 39 years behind bars, Vernon's confession led to the Ohio Innocence Project reinvestigating and were granted a motion for a new trial. Jackson and Wiley Bridgman, who both had their charges dropped and were released. Ronnie Bridgman, who had since changed his name to Kwame Ajamu, was released less than a month later. Ricky Jackson spent 39 years in prison, which is the longest time any person has spent behind bars for a crime that they did not commit. The critical issue of this case is the misconduct of the police officers who coerced Vernon, and then the second issue of this case was a false accusation and perjury, which was obviously caused by the coercion of police. While Eddie Vernon was the one who had initially gone to the police in the beginning, he later tried to recant his statement. The police told him it was too late to change the stories, although they couldn't threaten a child. They did threaten his parents. They said to Edward that they would send his parents to jail for perjury. On top of this coerced false statement, there was no physical or forensic evidence linking the boys to the crime, and that is on top of many contradicting eyewitness statements that were called by the defense. The first chapter we're going to look at is law and social control. The case in 1975 was initially a matter of state law. Jackson was sentenced to death by electric chair, which was later reduced to life, and the specific statutes that he'd violated and was convicted for was aggravated murder with specifications of aggravated robbery and attempted aggravated murder. Jackson's, once he was exonerated, he sued the 8 officers involved and the city, which was a case of federal law. This case sued the officers and those involved, aka the city, that allowed Cleveland police officers to partake in misconduct and coercion. The next chapter we're looking at is jurisprudence. This form of jurisprudence that I want to focus on was the critical race theory, which states that there is not enough representation of people of color in law. These 3 men would have never been convicted if they were white. There just simply wasn't enough evidence, and everyone involved in the case besides these men were white people in power. Representation is needed in law enforcement, all the way from police officers to lawyers and judges. There is clearly a power imbalance here, and the critical race theory acknowledges that there isn't enough representation, and without this representation, white supremacy is easily upheld, and it is written all over Jackson's case. The next chapter we're going to be looking at is the socio-legal perspective. The one I identified was Karl Marx's view of law as a reflection of the political economy, which is complicit in oppression and exploitation. Oppression and exploitation are clearly seen in this case. Oppression is seen in the incarceration of 3 innocent Black men, despite the lack of evidence. They were clearly upholding oppression in this case. They were keeping Black men in prison while white people were in power, like they'd stated before. Exploitation is also a huge part of this case. Edward Vernon was only 12 years old when he was coerced by the police to falsely testify. Police knew that they could exploit a child. They knew that the child didn't know the scope of the law. He didn't know what the consequences were. He didn't know what he was doing, and the officers took advantage of that. The next chapter we're going to look at is the critique of law. In this case, I identified the radical critique of law, which highlights that law is used to maintain hierarchies and keep certain people in power, as well as promoting violence. Jackson's case is a clear example of white supremacy in upholding this status quo that devalues Black lives. In addition, violence is clearly seen in this case as with the use of the death penalty at the beginning of Jackson's sentence. With the clear lack of evidence that I have detailed throughout this whole presentation, a death penalty would not be called for, but it was because he was a Black man and white supremacy was the goal in this case. Thank you so much for listening and being interested in Ricky Jackson's story. If you are interested in the rest of the case, or Wiley and Ronnie Bridgman, who are also involved, take a look at these resources that I listed below and used in this presentation. Again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.